and we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is.
The first generation iPhone released back in June 2007, aiming to turn what we think of a smartphone completely on its head. And now, 16 years later, it's safe to say it succeeded in doing so. When it was released, nobody had seen anything like it before. It was a completely new kind of device, or, as it was announced on stage, 3 major devices rolled into one.
A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices.
It certainly was these 3 things. Surfing the web wasn't, and still isn't, the smoothest thing on it, but it was leaps ahead of any other mobile device. It's never really fair to judge something through a modern day lens, and just listening to the audience's reactions during that famous presentation, you can see how big of a deal it was back then.
5 buttons across the bottom, playlists, artists, songs, videos, and more. I'm in artists right now. Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger and I scroll. That's it.
But what holds up all this time later? The design of this particular iPhone is quite unique, being round on the sides but much thicker than the phone that came after it, the iPhone 3G. It also has a mostly aluminum back, something that we wouldn't see again till the iPhone 5. It has a plastic tab on the bottom so mobile reception can pass through. Speaking of mobile reception, this phone only supports 2G networks, which was being overshadowed by 3G even at release, something the iPhone 3G would fix the year later. On top of the device, we have the lock button, SIM tray, and unique headphone jack. It's a bit of a different headphone jack that only this iPhone had, that quite simply meant not a lot of headphones fit properly. The ones that came with the phone did, and most little earbuds were fine. Still annoying, and another thing fixed the year later. Turning to the side of the device, we have the mute switch and volume buttons. Pretty standard, they haven't changed a whole lot from this. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. This phone features a Samsung made chip. Underclocked to 412 MHz, this was done to increase battery life and was still enough performance back in the day to keep the phone fast enough. It had 128 MB of RAM, not a whole lot, fine for the time, but not well for keeping it fast for long. There's a 1400 mAh battery, allowing for 8 hours of phone call talk time or 150 hours of standby. The one I have here achieves nowhere near that anymore, and I wouldn't expect it to after so long. It gets roughly 1 hour of screen on time after being unplugged and about 2 days of standby, which is pretty good considering it is almost 16 years old. The camera on the back is 2 megapixels. It takes photos, not great ones, but photos. It wasn't great for the time, but it got the job done. Back then, people weren't concerned about how great the camera was, but that it was amazing that it had one in the first place that would work in a pinch. It can't record video naturally. That would come 2 years later with the iPhone 3GS, though jailbreaking is possible to get video to work. The core experience this phone delivers all this time later is far from perfect. It's quite slow, apps don't stay open in the background due to multitasking being introduced in a later update, and the tiny amount of RAM it has. But it can be given a pass for the lack of speed due to it being the first iPhone. It's hard to criticize a device like this. It brought so much that any negatives were hard to argue against back in the day, and any negatives it did have, the devices it was made to compete against had at least double the issues that it had. App support is pretty much non-existent, plus the App Store is one of the slower aspects to this phone. Back in the day, the App Store wasn't actually a thing. It came a year after this phone did, in 2008 with iPhone OS 2. Steve Jobs didn't actually think it was a good idea at first. believing the way forward was with developers making web apps for the device instead. It became clear, however, that a dedicated app store would make for a much better experience, so that's what they did. The reason for this lack of app support is due to the lack of new software. This is because the first iPhone's final version is iPhone OS 3, giving it 3 years of software support, being one of the only two iPhones to receive this little. It and the iPhone 3G were the only two iPhones to receive 3 years. Every iPhone since has had 4 years or more at least. It doesn't run fast or smooth as most newer phones on its last version, but nowhere near as bad as the 4S on iOS 9. It was probably good to stop it here, as the 3G, which stopped the next year on iOS 4, had very similar internals to the first iPhone, but got slowed down really badly on iOS 4. So, had the original iPhone gotten it, it would have been a much more frustrating experience. But, stepping back from third-party apps, this phone still functions okay. The calculator calculates, the Notes app is fine for taking notes, and looks rather nice due to the skeuomorphic look. The clock app functions fine, it still tells the time and date fine. Messages won't send due to not having a SIM card, same with calls. If you happen to be in a country with 2G still being available, like Poland, for some reason there's a plan to keep 2G up and running for another 5 to 6 years there, this phone will still function as a regular phone if it's in range. Although using this as your daily phone would be quite hard for nearly everyone who does more than just calls, even web browsing. Safari does work, but very slowly, even on Wi-Fi, and most web pages will struggle to load it correctly. If you have a large iTunes library of music and shows, they should sync without much issue, and it still has the iPod app, which got replaced by 2 separate apps not too long after, which is the Music and Videos app. It was called the greatest iPod ever back in the day, which was the case, so you could theoretically listen and watch shows downloaded and bought even today. But why do that when you could stream them, right? As you can see, the old YouTube app is still here. It doesn't work anymore though, and the new one would have to be downloaded, which it can't on this device. There are ways to get it to work with jailbreaking, although watching media on this device isn't the easiest task due to the screen quality. The iPhone 2G features a 480 by 320 screen, which gives it a pixel density of 163 pixels per inch. This may not mean much to a lot of people watching, but basically that's not great by today's standards. You can see pixels, and you don't have to look too closely to see them either. It was okay back in the day and was the default for pretty much all mobile devices, which is why the iPhone 4's Retina display was such a big deal back in 2010, as it pretty much quadrupled the amount of pixels on screen, making things look crisp and clear for the first time. Back then, people weren't worried about the screen quality, how nice the cameras were, how fast the apps could open, or how long it took to be able to load web pages, but that it could, and could do it easily, without much confusion or adjustments. The legacy the iPhone left was huge, and only a few years later could that become even more clear, as companies changed things up radically to keep up, and companies that didn't, like BlackBerry, fell from grace and fell into obsolescence quickly, as customers had moved on from the phones that company was still offering. So to summarize, the iPhone 1 was a revolutionary device, capable of so much back then and so little now, but overall stood the test of time as well as you would expect. Thank you for watching, and if you found this interesting, please consider liking the video and maybe subscribing. More videos coming soon.